embark on the Great Canadian Farm Tour, it is important to acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples. Agriculture in the Classroom Canada recognizes and honors the enduring presence of the diverse Indigenous communities across Canada, including the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. We acknowledge the deep connection that Indigenous peoples have to the land, waters, resources, and all of agriculture. We express our gratitude for their stewardship and custodianship of these lands for generations. Agriculture in the Classroom Canada recognizes that acknowledging the traditional territories we reside and work on is only a small step towards reconciliation. We ask that we all continue to learn more about the Indigenous peoples in these regions, to consider the history and ongoing colonialism on this land, and to reflect on how each of us can contribute to reconciliation.
Hello, and welcome everyone to our next stop on Season 4 of the Great Canadian Farm Tour. We are so excited to have everyone join us today from all across Canada. My name is Kalisha from Agriculture in the Classroom Canada, and I will be your MC for today. Before we get started, we just wanted to provide a few reminders. One, for those who want to follow along in French, please use the Boost Lingo link provided in the chat or event description to access the interpreting services provided for today. We also ask that everyone is mindful. This is an educational event, so inappropriate conduct happening in the chat, such as spamming or improper comments, will not be tolerated. 3, throughout the tour, we welcome you to post your questions in the chat to get them answered. We will answer as many questions as possible. 4, the mystery word for your student activity books will appear at the end of this episode, so please stick around to see it. 5, students, important answers to your student activity book, such as the territorial tree and the meaning of the territorial coat of arms, will be shared during the brain break. 5, finally, we would love to know where everyone is joining us from, so please comment in the chat your school location. Now, we would love to welcome our next tour host of the Great Canadian Farm Tour, James Conway, who is a hydroponic specialist at the Barrett Centre of Innovation in Sustainable Urban Agriculture at Durham College in Ontario.
Hello. Like you said, I'm a member of the Barrett Centre of Innovation in Sustainable Urban Agriculture. And that's a lot of big words, but what that really means is that we're trying to actually develop farms that are going to be here when you're all grown up and hopefully providing apples and food for all those that need it around us. I'm a graduate of Durham College's Horticulture Technician program, and I also managed to work on the farm there for 2 years, gaining a lot of experience. Before that, I had a degree in IT and networking security, so I found a love of technology and plants and somehow managed to blend them together into this job.
That's awesome. It's wonderful to get to hear more about your background and experiences. Are there any schools you'd like to say hello to before we get started?
Oh, absolutely. Hello and welcome to the Durham District School Board. Thank you for all your time with me as my youth.
Awesome. Thanks to everyone across Canada for joining us today. I will now take a quick leave and hand over the controls to James so that we can get started on this amazing tour at the Barrett Centre of Innovation in Sustainable Urban Agriculture at Durham College, as we mentioned. I will return periodically to share questions being asked by students from across Canada.
Sounds good. So welcome to our hydroponic farm. If you want to take a step inside and take a look at some of the plants we're growing. So everything you see here is being grown hydroponically. And what that means is it's being grown purely in water with no soil or anything like that, which is a bit strange to think of it because you'll often hear of people overwatering or underwatering their plants. And the theory that a plant could be in water all times and live to such a success is quite a quandary. It's almost magical to me. But a lot of it is thanks to a little mineral thing that we have called rock wool. It's actually something similar to how cotton candy is made. Have any of you ever seen how cotton candy was made? Well, if you have, what they do is they'll often melt sugar down, almost to like a lava-like state, and then spin it really rapidly, and it creates these thin, wispy fibers. Rock wool is created in a very similar way. They actually melt rocks, and they spin it, and they create these thin, wispy fibers, which are then put together into these tight little balls. And this actually creates a home for the seedlings to grow in. So you don't need any soil to grow in to start. And when you think about it, the soil is like a bunch of little sponges to begin with. It's usually made up of 3 different kinds of particles. So you've got clay, sand, and silt. And each of them are different sizes and have different abilities to hold water. But if you have too much of, say, clay, you might actually prevent your plant from actually getting oxygen in its roots. Which, how is it getting oxygen in water? Actually, let me show you that. What we actually do is we employ what are called air stones. So if anyone has a fish tank, you might actually recognize these at home, but these are very fine rocks with holes in it that actually push oxygen through it. Now that oxygen actually interacts with the root zone on plants, and it lets them breathe and take in all the air they need. Most people think plants only use CO2, but the oxygen is very important. And when you're doing a hydroponic system like this, plants that really need a lot of oxygen, like rosemary, can actually thrive, where they might actually struggle in your soil. So, what is special about rock wool? Well, rock wool is inert, and that's a very fancy way of saying there's nothing special about it by default. But it can take on the properties of things around it. So, with water that we've specifically made for the plants, we can give it the exact environment it needs. And it sounds complicated, but it's really not much different than making, say, lemonade at home. Have any of you made lemonade before? If you have, you probably realize that it's a mix of lemon juice and sugar. And getting that right ratio is the troublesome part. You might add a little bit too much sugar and then it's too sweet to drink, or not enough and it really just tastes like lemon. But once you can get that right balance of the two, it gives you everything you need to have a delicious drink. Now, when you're younger, you probably want a lot less sugar. Plants are very similar for this. When we're using fertilizer, they want a lot less of it at the start. And when they get bigger, you can start adding more of it, and they'll be happy, just like you with more sugar. As a demo, I'll just show you. So, here we have our water, lemon juice, and sugar. And we want to get the perfect balance. So I did a bit of research earlier just to figure out general metrics of how much of each to do. And with 2 liters of water, you want generally about 2 cups of sugar to 2 cups of lemon juice. And there's another interesting property that happens here when we add the sugar to the water. It dissolves. Now, water often has an ability to only hold so much of a nutrient or sediment before it gets saturated. That means there's too much in it, it can't hold anymore. Oddly, this value can change when you add heat to the table. So like with making lava, by adding heat to your water, you can add more sugar. So lemon juice also is great as an analogy for this, a referral, because lemon juice is acidic. And when we're actually making this water, it's not just the sugar or the nutrients we care about, but it's also about the acidity. Now, when you think about acid, you probably think of cartoons and having it pour on something and watching it melt away. Well, that's kind of the property we're going for. By adding this into our water, we're also letting those sediments or rocks that we're adding in to melt down a little bit better. And this, again, in turn, increases the amount that we can add in before it reaches that saturation point. So I'm just going to go ahead and mix a healthy amount of lemon juice in here. And I will put it in here. May have needed to get a bigger container. Knowledge for next time. But like you see, you can fill it up and you get that blend of the two. And that gives us what we want. But when we're talking plants, we have to use something more like a fertilizer. So, how do we do that? Well, it's actually very similar. You could just take a powdered fertilizer and add it to water, and you get what one of my friends in college like to call forbidden Kool-Aid. Do not drink the forbidden Kool-Aid. You will get a very upset stomach. It does not taste good. But plants love it. It's great for plants. It gives it everything it needs. So once you have all of this in the right ratio, you can get happy plants, no matter what kind you want. As you see here, we mainly grow lettuce, but we've experimented with adding things like peppers, flowers, and herbs. One of my favorite things to grow here has actually become the violas. telling my friends that I get to spend an hour a week picking flowers kind of makes them jealous. We also have up here some micro peppers. Micro peppers are cool because they've been specifically made to only grow to a certain height, or at least that was the intention of it. I've kind of let mine grow larger, or they've somehow done so. These kinds of microplants are important because if we ever want to travel in space, we need to be able to produce food for as much people as we can using as little space as possible. So if we can focus on food and production with less vegetative production, we might actually have our way to Mars not too far. But that's not the only purpose of this unit. A lot of what we do here is charitable. Almost all of the lettuce we grow goes to a food bank called Second Harvest. They take the food and they give it to people who need it, hungry people who have no other access to food. And that gives me the inspiration to work hard here every single day because I know what I'm doing really does matter. That said, you don't need a fancy system like this if you want to actually grow food at home. I actually developed methods using similar systems to this that you can do very cheap for maybe even $12 or $15, depending on how big you want to go. So I've actually created some small demos here just so you can kind of see how the system works. So using our rock wool, we'll actually put them inside of these rafts. And this raft is actually able to float on the nutrified water. And from below, the plug will reach out, touch the water, and take it in. Now this is actually how the roots will expand and form almost like a web-like structure. If you actually want to come over here, I'll lift up these zinnias so you can get a bit of a look. They form almost what looks like a beautiful spider web underneath. And that is just such a healthy root system that they can get access to anything they want. Now, the beautiful thing about this system is you don't have to just tune it for 1 or 2 plants. You can tune it for lettuce, you can tune it for flowers, or you can tune it for anything you want, as long as you actually take the measurements and are careful when you add your nutrients. But how do you do that? Well, there's 2 values that you care about. And they're going to sound a little bit complex, but trust me, they're not that bad once you actually understand it. So there's electrical conductivity and there's pH. Now, pH we've already talked about. That's the acid in the water. Now, that helps bring the level down and helps a lot of sediments dissolve. Well, electrical conductivity is the measure of the actual amounts of nutrients in the water, the fertilizer. This is actually done because when you add certain things to water, it actually allows electricity to flow through it. So what we can do is we can actually use sensors that send small electrical signals between each other, and that will actually measure how much there is in each of the water. And this is pretty much the basics to hydroponics. I know it sounded very confusing at the start, but having it broken down to some simple steps, I think anyone can do it. And I would absolutely encourage you all to get into it if you have any interest. Like I said, you can do it in very easy systems, like you can have it in a 5-gallon bucket, or you can even use 120-liter totes. Or if you even want to go very small scale at home, you can do things like this and just take a mason jar and put a net cup in the top. Really, the world's up to you and what you want to do with it, but you will see that it's so much easier than growing in soil, where you might actually, ironically, drown your plant, and in water you might not.
All right, James, we do have a few questions there. If you'd like to answer them in the chat, we have about 4 questions.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So the first one is from Emily Walker. Do plants grow faster with lights than they do outside?
So that's actually a good question. The sun is definitely the best source of light. It's so potent that you will see a lot better growth overall. But when you have bad climate conditions, or if it's too cold, you won't see anywhere near those kinds of results. And in which case, you might have much better results using indoor grow lights. What kind of grow light you use matters as well, as there's something referred to as a light spectrum. And when you're growing plants, you want something known as a full spectrum, so that has all the different colors in it. Think of a light spectrum as like a rainbow. For a little while, we thought only red and blue mattered. But over time, we discovered that plants were using every single one of the colors, even the green, that we think as being the least valuable, it all has a little bit of value to the plants. So again, to summarize, well, grow lights can be very great. The sun is definitely by far your best choice if it is your option.
Awesome. All right, the next question that we have there is, if you could grow anything, what would it be?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, at home, I am actually growing a hydroponic coffee plant. I bought a coffee plant back when I had started college, and I washed off all the roots, and I had actually created a hydroponic bucket very similar to the one you see here with the net cup, and I have left it in there for about 3 years. And that plant is probably about 2 years away from actually offering me some coffee beans, which I very much look forward to.
Awesome. So we're going to move on to one more question before we go to our brain break, and then we'll return to some questions after. What types of plants grow best in a hydroponic farm?
So you can pretty much grow anything you'd like, but the limitation is your lights. So the lights we have emit at what are referred to as micromoles. That's the amount of light that is emitted over a small area. We get about 250 with our default lighting, but you can see that I've added some extra lighting up here, supplemental lighting, and this allows us to go up to about 1,000 micromoles. You need that if you want to do anything like a fruiting crop or flowers, because they have a much higher light need. But in general, with a low intensity light, you'll do really well with lettuce, herbs, and kale. Any kind of leafy green will have a great success.
That's great. So we will now take a brief brain break to learn a little bit more about Ontario, and we'll be back shortly. All righty, we're back with James, who's now sharing more with us about the hydroponic operation.
Welcome back. So, just so you can get a general idea how the system works. From the very start, the water is all stored in a reservoir on the bottom of the system, if you want to take a shot on that. We have 2 pumps, and the pumps take the water from the bottom, and they will redistribute it, so they'll move it up this pipe into each of the runways. So that'll start filling it, and that act of filling it will push the water down the runway to the other end. And there's a very small cylindrical tube that will poke up at the end of the runway, which makes sure that there's always a little bit of water left in there. And that's important because if there's ever any kind of power outage or I can't get here for whatever reason, there's always going to be a minimum amount of water in the system, so the plants always have something to drink. This also functions to recirculate the water, so it keeps it moving all around the system, which lets the nutrients stay mixed and doesn't lead to any kind of buildup happening. A lot of times with these kinds of systems, you'll have problems where some of those dissolved fertilizer you've added will recrystallize and then they'll form back up in a spot, which is problematic because that'll throw off any kind of reading you want to take to actually understand how much nutrients are left in the water. But with that said, that's all there is to this system. It's just constantly moving the water around. And that's all you really need to actually get a proper hydroponic system. There's so many different types you can go to if you want to go to something a little bit more oxygenated, You might even look into something called aeroponics. And that's where the plant will actually sit in the open air. And it will actually have nozzles spraying water on the plant's roots. So that actually gives it a lot more oxygen. But with a system like this, we just need to rely on our air step. And what that does is it's just going to keep putting oxygen molecules in between the water molecules. And what we can see is the bubbles, but there's definitely smaller amounts that are going in there that our eyes aren't able to see. And that oxygen lives between the water, and that's actually the oxygen the plant is going to breathe. So as long as you can keep providing oxygen, nutrients, and lights, hydroponic systems will do the rest for you. That's one of the joys about this system too, is it's a controlled environment. So while it might be very hot outside or raining like it's been for the past week here, I always have a perfectly set area designated for these plants to grow. The temperature is always the same, the light's always the same, always have what they want. And when it comes to plants, having some kind of reliable source of everything is going to make them happiest. And that's why we actually have so many large heads of lettuce that are just happy. Speaking of which, I brought some smaller samples from the back up to the front here so that you could see what they kind of look like in their early stages. So these are Monte Carlo romaine lettuce starts that I started about 2 weeks ago. You can see that they've already kind of grown remarkably in size. It takes a total of about 6 weeks to go from start to finish. So once they get to about this size, I will be putting them in one of these rafts, and then they will go into the main system, where they'll spend their next 4 weeks. Now, the best part about this system is there's 8 runways. So if we wanted to just produce lettuce year-round, we could do 2 different runways every week and ensure that we're always producing around 40 kilograms of lettuce to go to charity. That said, we have a bit of a limitation here, and that's that we lose water in November. The city here is gracious enough to provide us with water for the rest of the year, and we really appreciate that. But in these winter months, we've actually had to think of some innovative strategies to kind of keep the system running. What I've actually done is I've taken that system that I mentioned earlier, that extra inch of water that's always in the runway, and I've actually used that to our advantage. So I actually turn off our pumps, and then I will put in fresh water that we have stored outside that's freezing cold, and I'll leave it overnight. And by doing that, I can actually keep this system running all winter, even though we don't have any permanent water fixtures. And that's also why I've expanded to do some flowers here. We've previously were going down to one side and just using the other to bring the water up to temperature. But this year we're trying a new design and trying to innovate.
Alrighty. We have a lot of questions, so we'll try and get through them as quickly as possible and hope we can get through most of them. Easton would like to know how big your plants can grow.
Oh, that really depends on how big of a system you can provide it. If you have a large enough container and you can provide it support, you could grow even a tree hydroponically in theory. At home, my coffee plant is probably the tallest thing I've grown, and that's around 3 feet tall.
A tree. Wow. That's awesome. I've learned something new for sure. Okay, we'll head on to the next one. Joyce, I believe this is a teacher. So Kaden would like to know, how long does it take plants to grow in the greenhouse?
In a greenhouse? Well, that can vary. One of the main factors will be the person taking care of it. Some people will be a little bit too attentive to their plant and they'll water it every day, and this can actually set the plant back. One of the key things with plants is patience. So you often want to let things dry out fully before you water it again, and that'll actually let its roots keep expanding as they keep looking. So you will generally have about the same time in the greenhouse as you will in a hydroponic system, assuming that the person taking care of the plants is taking proper care of the plants. So you could probably say another 6 weeks for lettuce if you want to grow it in a greenhouse.
Awesome. Next question we have here is, Elijah wants to know if you could run out of water or what happens if you don't have the power for lights. Good question.
So, that is a good question. When you don't have the power for lights, the system is actually a little bit of a risk, because when you lose power for lights, you also lose power for the air conditioning and heating system on the back. So, If I lose power for more than, say, a day, the temperature in here might start to match the temperature outside, and then the plants will maybe not die, as there will still be a bit of residual heat in here, but they will definitely slow down in growth. And if I lose water, if I am not able to come here and turn the pumps off, that'll cause them to keep running without any water to cool it until it actually stops and seizes and it can no longer work. So then I'd have to replace the pumps and possibly other parts of the system. So ideally, if there's a power outage, I'm here immediately to fix it.
Well, that's good. That was a great question from Elijah. Next question we have here is, what if you want to grow a plant that needs pollination?
That's a good question, actually. So peppers do actually need pollination. And the solution to that, an electric toothbrush, if you believe me. So all you have to do is you actually take it, and then you become the bumblebee, going from flower to flower, getting the pollen onto your toothbrush and going between the flowers. And you can see it can become a bit of a process, especially if you want to do enough plants like this. But I'm a bumblebee now.
That is awesome. Wow. I just keep learning new things today, honestly. The next question that we have is, my grade 2 wants to know how warm it can get in the greenhouse.
Ooh, in an actual greenhouse itself, it can get well over 35 degrees Celsius on a hot day, and at which point you yourself should not be in the greenhouse. Even the plants ideally would not like to be in there. It really depends on what kind of greenhouse you're talking to. Some might have better systems to move the heat out, and will actively do it when a sensor reads that it has gotten to a certain heat. A lot of them will also have vents on top, which will cause the hot air to rise and go right out there. The hottest I've ever been in was a 42 degrees Celsius, and I was pruning tomatoes.
That's pretty hot. We're going to take 2 more questions, and then we're unfortunately going to have to sign off, I think. It's great to see that everyone is super interested and they have tons of questions. I still have tons of questions myself. But Miss Cummings' class wants to know, how do you know when the plants are ready to be picked?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
How do you know when the plants are ready to be picked?
Okay, so that really varies based on each plant. But for lettuce, I like to wait until it's become about a sizable, large enough that it's really enough for one person to eat. One thing I've been told is that professional chefs like their lettuce to be the size of someone's mouth, so that it's easier for the eater to actually have their food. But I found that these plants grow so well once you get them to a certain size that it's almost sad to cut them early. And I like to let them get to that full size, because then when we're giving this food to people who actually need it, they have more food and not just pretty food.
That's great. One last question for today for our tour. Marshall asks, how long have you been in this business?
Well, if you count the time that I was working at the college, this will probably be my 5th year total. I spent the first 2 working a vertical hydroponics. So unlike this, it would be built into towers that would actually be stacked beside each other. And those systems are actually really good for saving space. But when you're actually working in them, they're very inconvenient. It's very claustrophobic. It's hard to move around, and you can easily hit things if you're not careful. Here, there's plenty of space to actually do everything I want. I can actually move around, and this is just night and day better.
That's great. Well, as you know, James, we're running out of time. So we'd just like to know if there's any final words you'd like to share to our watchers today.
Always use your imagination. Don't let it stop. That's what will fuel your future ideas, and you'll be able to create so much more if you let your mind wander. And at the same time, don't be afraid to be kind to people. Kindness is the best strength out there, and try to be the strongest person you can be.
Well, I think that's some pretty good advice. And I hope you all learned something new today. I know that I did. Before we close off this episode, and thank you for waiting patiently, I'm excited to share the mystery word is family owned. So thank you again to James at the Barrett Centre for joining us on this episode of the Great Canadian Farm Tour. Our next stop will be on November 27th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time at a cranberry farm in British Columbia. Goodbye for now.